Sometimes a man runs to the mountains not to find something, but to lose himself completely. For 15 winters, that's exactly what Otis Buckner has been doing in the Colorado wilderness, with only his loyal dog Chester for company. The old mountain man knows every tree and trail in these frozen peaks. But today, something stops him cold on his trapline. A massive cottonwood tree stands before him, its trunk swollen with 2 huge bulges. Chester growls and backs away. Then Otis hears it, a soft whimpering sound coming from inside the tree itself. One of the bulges is moving, pulsing like something alive is trapped within the bark. In all his years in these mountains, Otis has never seen anything like this. What could be living inside a tree? And why does it stir up memories he's tried so hard to forget? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air cut through Otis Buckner's lungs like shards of glass, each breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry mountain atmosphere. At 62, his body bore the marks of 15 hard winters in the Colorado Territory, weathered skin stretched tight over lean muscle, hands scarred from countless encounters with barbed wire and sharp stone, and eyes that had learned to read the subtle language of approaching storms in the shifting patterns of cloud and wind. Chester padded alongside him through the knee-deep snow, the grizzled hound's breath steaming in the frigid air. The dog's coat had grown thick and coarse over their years together, changing from the sleek brown of his youth to a mottled grey that matched the winter landscape. They moved with the practiced rhythm of long companionship, Chester's nose working constantly to read scents that told stories Otis could never fully understand. The passage of elk during the night, the territorial markings of a mountain lion, the subtle chemical signature that warned of an approaching blizzard still hours away. Otis reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden cross, its surface worn smooth by years of nervous handling. The carving was crude, made with the same knife he used to clean fish and prepare game, but it had been with him through every difficult day since he'd arrived in these mountains. He'd lost his faith somewhere between the battlefields of Antietam and the cholera outbreak that claimed his family, but he couldn't quite bring himself to throw the cross away. It reminded him of simpler times when prayer seemed to actually reach someone who cared enough to listen. The trapline stretched for nearly 10 miles through terrain that would challenge men half his age. Otis had built it slowly over the years, learning the migration patterns of beaver and marten, understanding where the animals would travel when winter drove them to seek shelter and food. Each trap was positioned with surgical precision, a skill he'd developed during his years as a field medic in the war, when the difference between life and death often came down to understanding exactly where to place his hands. Those memories still haunted his dreams. The screaming of wounded soldiers, the smell of gunpowder mixed with blood, the terrible choices he'd been forced to make when medical supplies ran low and too many men needed saving. He'd been good at it, too good. Officers had sought him out specifically, knowing that Otis Buckner could keep a man alive long enough to get him to a proper field hospital. But being good at saving lives in war meant being intimately familiar with death, and that knowledge had changed something fundamental inside him. His cabin sat in a natural depression between 2 ridges, positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds while remaining hidden from casual observation. Otis had chosen the location carefully, understanding that isolation was both his greatest protection and his most dangerous vulnerability. The structure itself was modest but sturdy. Thick log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew cleanly without betraying his location with excessive smoke, and a roof designed to shed snow without collapsing under the weight of accumulated storms. Inside, the cabin reflected 15 years of gradual accumulation. Shelves lined the walls, holding mason jars filled with preserved vegetables, dried herbs for both cooking and basic medical care, and the various tools necessary for mountain survival. His medical bag sat in a place of honor near the fireplace, its leather cracked with age, but its contents still meticulously organized. He told himself repeatedly that he would never practice medicine again, but he couldn't quite bring himself to abandon the instruments that had once meant the difference between life and death. Chester had appeared during his third winter, a half-starved puppy abandoned by some passing travelers who probably assumed he wouldn't survive the harsh mountain conditions. Otis had found him near death, hypothermic and dehydrated, and his medical instincts had taken over before his isolation could reassert itself. Nursing the dog back to health had reminded him what it felt like to save a life without the accompanying horror of war, and Chester had simply never left. The dog had proven to be an ideal companion for mountain life. His instincts were sharp, his loyalty absolute, and his ability to sense danger had saved Otis's life on more than one occasion. Chester could detect the approach of storms hours before they arrived, sense the presence of large predators long before they became visible, and navigate through blizzard conditions that would leave a human helplessly lost. But more than that, he provided something Otis hadn't realized he needed, a living connection to something other than his own bitter memories. Their daily routine had developed organically over the years. They would rise before dawn, share a simple breakfast of coffee and whatever game Otis had prepared the night before, and then set out to check the trapline. The work was methodical and demanding, requiring them to cover miles of difficult terrain while remaining alert for signs of danger. Mountain lions, wolves, and bears all called these peaks home, and a moment of inattention could prove fatal for both man and dog. But today felt different. Chester's behavior had been unusual since they'd left the cabin, ears constantly pricked forward, nose working overtime, and a tension in his body that suggested he was processing sensory information that disturbed him. Otis had learned to trust the dog's instincts completely. Chester had never been wrong about approaching danger, and his current state of alertness suggested something significant was happening in their territory, the memory that had begun stirring. When they first encountered the strange tree was becoming more insistent now. It pulled at the edges of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream, bringing with it emotions he'd spent 15 years trying to bury. The loss of his wife Martha and their young son Benjamin had broken something fundamental inside him. He'd been away, tending to wounded soldiers when the cholera outbreak swept through their small town. By the time he'd returned, they were already buried in the hastily dug cemetery outside town, victims of a disease he might have been able to treat if he'd been there. The guilt had consumed him. All his medical knowledge, all his skill at preserving life in impossible circumstances, and he couldn't save the two people who mattered most. The townspeople had tried to comfort him, explaining that the outbreak had been swift and merciless, claiming victims faster than anyone could respond. But their words felt hollow against the weight of his failure. He'd saved strangers on distant battlefields, while his own family died alone and afraid. That's when he'd made the decision to disappear into the mountains. He'd sold everything he owned, packed only the most essential supplies, and walked away from civilization entirely. The plan had been simple: lose himself in the wilderness, away from the constant reminders of his failure, away from well-meaning friends who couldn't understand his pain, away from a medical practice that now felt like a mockery of everything he'd been unable to do when it truly mattered. The years had passed with surprising speed. Each season brought its own challenges and rewards, creating a rhythm that gradually replaced the chaos of his former life. He learned to read weather patterns, to track animals, to find food and shelter in conditions that would kill most men. The mountains demanded everything from him: strength, intelligence, adaptability, and an almost supernatural awareness of his environment. In return, they offered something he'd never expected to find again: peace. But peace, he was learning, was not the same thing as healing. The memories were still there, carefully buried, but never truly forgotten. And now, standing before this impossible tree with its moving bulges and mysterious sounds, he felt those old wounds beginning to reopen. Chester sensed it too, pressing closer to his leg in a gesture of support that spoke to the deep bond they developed over their years together. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they completed their circuit of the trapline. 3 successful catches, 2 marten and a beaver, would provide both meat and pelts for the coming weeks. But Otis found himself unable to focus on these practical considerations. His mind kept returning to the tree, to the sound he'd heard from within its bark, and to the strange sense of recognition that had stirred memories he'd tried so hard to forget. As they approached the cabin, Chester suddenly stopped and turned back toward the direction they'd come from. His ears were fully erect now, and a low whine escaped his throat, a sound Otis had never heard from him before. It wasn't fear exactly, but something more complex. Anticipation mixed with unease, as if the dog understood that their discovery today had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Otis looked back as well, but the tree was no longer visible through the dense forest. Still, he could feel its presence like a weight on his consciousness, pulling at him with an intensity that grew stronger rather than weaker with distance. Whatever was happening in that cottonwood, whatever force was responsible for the impossible sounds and movements they'd witnessed, it wasn't finished with them yet. That night, as he prepared their evening meal and tended to the day's catch, Otis found himself handling his old medical instruments. His fingers moved automatically over the familiar tools, scalpels, forceps, sutures, and the various implements he'd once used to fight death itself. He'd maintained them carefully over the years, keeping them sharp and clean, despite his conviction that he would never use them again. Now, for the first time in 15 years, he wondered if that conviction might be tested. Chester lay by the fire, but his rest was fitful. Even in sleep, his ears twitched at sounds only he could hear, and occasionally he would lift his head to stare in the direction of their morning's discovery. Whatever instincts governed the dog's understanding of the world, they were telling him that something fundamental had changed in their mountain sanctuary. As Otis finally settled into his own bed, the wooden cross clutched unconsciously in his weathered hand. He realized that tomorrow would bring a choice he wasn't sure he was prepared to make. He could ignore the tree, avoid that section of his trapline, and pretend that today's discovery had never happened. Or he could return, investigate further, and risk confronting whatever lay hidden within that impossible growth. The decision, he knew, would determine not just his immediate future, but whether the peace he'd built in these mountains could survive the awakening of memories he'd spent 15 years trying to bury. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the promise of another storm. But for the first time in years, Otis found himself wondering if the real tempest was still ahead of them, waiting in the heart of an ancient tree that defied every natural law he thought he understood. The sleepless night left Otis feeling hollow and restless, as if something inside him had been wound too tight and refused to settle. Chester had been equally disturbed, pacing the cabin's small confines and whining softly at irregular intervals. By the time pale dawn light began filtering through the single window, both man and dog seemed to reach the same unspoken conclusion. They had to return to the tree. Otis gathered his supplies with methodical precision, but his hands moved toward items he hadn't touched in years. The medical bag came down from its shelf, its leather surface still supple, despite the dry mountain air. Inside, the instruments lay nested in their appointed places like sleeping soldiers awaiting orders. Scalpels, forceps, a bone saw he prayed he wouldn't need, vials of carbolic acid for sterilization, and rolls of clean linen for bandages. His fingers traced over each tool, muscle memory awakening skills he'd thought permanently buried. The walk back to the cottonwood felt different in daylight. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if the usual population of birds and small mammals had decided to avoid this particular area. Chester moved with obvious reluctance, staying close to Otis's leg and frequently looking back toward the safety of familiar territory. His hackles weren't raised, but his entire body remained tense, with the kind of alertness that suggested he was prepared to fight or flee at the first sign of real danger. When the tree came into view, Otis stopped so abruptly that Chester bumped into his leg. In the clear morning light, the cottonwood appeared even more impossible than it had the day before. The trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, its bark a mottled grey-brown that seemed to shift and flow like water when viewed from the corner of his eye. But it was the bulges that demanded attention, 2 massive swellings that distorted the tree's natural shape like tumors or growths that had consumed whatever lay beneath. The larger bulge, positioned about 6 feet from the ground, was roughly the size and shape of an adult human body. The smaller one, perhaps 3 feet higher, suggested the proportions of a child. Both pulsed with a rhythm that reminded Otis uncomfortably of a heartbeat, and as he watched, he could see subtle movements beneath the bark, as if something was trying to push its way out from the inside. Chester whined and pressed against his leg. But Otis found himself moving forward despite the dog's obvious distress. His medical training had taught him to approach the unknown methodically, to gather information before making decisions, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that whatever lay within this tree required immediate attention. He set down his medical bag and withdrew a thin-bladed scalpel. The bark felt warm under his touch, warmer than it should have been on a morning when his breath still formed clouds in the frigid air. When he pressed the blade against the surface, a clear fluid began to seep from the incision, not tree sap, but something that reminded him disturbingly of amniotic fluid. The cut revealed something that made his hands shake. Beneath the bark, instead of the expected wood grain, lay what appeared to be human skin. Pale, slightly translucent, but unmistakably human. Otis widened the incision carefully, his medical training overriding the part of his mind that was screaming at him to run. What he found inside defied every law of nature he thought he understood. A human hand lay beneath the bark, perfectly preserved, but somehow alive. The skin was soft and warm, the fingernails clean and well-formed. Most impossibly, when he touched it gently with his fingertip, the hand responded with a slight twitch, as if the person it belonged to was simply sleeping deeply. Otis's heart pounded as he moved to the smaller bulge and made a similar incision. Here, too, he found human flesh, the delicate skin of what appeared to be a child's arm. Like the hand below, it was warm and responsive, showing every sign of life despite being encased within the bark of an ancient tree. But it was what he found tucked into a natural hollow near the smaller bulge that nearly brought him to his knees. A small rectangular object wrapped in oiled cloth, a daguerreotype in a silver frame, the kind of formal portrait that had been popular before the war. The image showed a woman and child, their faces serious and dignified in the manner of early photography. The woman was Martha. His Martha, exactly as she had looked 15 years ago, down to the small scar on her left temple from a childhood accident. The child was Benjamin, his son, captured at age 7, with the same serious expression he'd worn when concentrating on his letters. But this was impossible. He'd buried their daguerreotype with them, placed it in Martha's hands before the coffin was sealed. Otis sank to his knees in the snow, the photograph trembling in his hands. Chester pressed against his side, offering what comfort he could. But the dog's own distress was evident in the constant movement of his ears and the way his eyes darted between his master and the tree. The sound that had drawn them here yesterday came again, stronger now, a soft whimpering that seemed to emerge from both bulges simultaneously. It was the sound a person might make while dreaming, lost in the depths of sleep, but trying to wake. The larger bulge pulsed more rapidly, and through the incision he'd made, Otis could see movement that suggested someone turning or shifting position. His medical mind tried to process what he was seeing in rational terms. Some form of suspended animation, perhaps, though he knew of no natural process that could preserve life in such a manner. The tree itself seemed to be functioning as some kind of organic cocoon. maintaining the vital functions of whatever lay within, while keeping them in a state between life and death. But his heart knew what his mind refused to accept. These were his wife and child, somehow preserved within this impossible tree, waiting for him to find them. The daguerreotype was proof, evidence that this was no random occurrence, but something specifically intended for him. After 15 years of guilt and isolation, Martha and Benjamin had been returned to him in a form he couldn't understand, but couldn't deny. Chester's growl brought him back to immediate awareness. The dog was staring at the tree with his lips pulled back from his teeth, a warning rumble building in his chest. Following the dog's gaze, Otis saw that both bulges were moving more actively now, as if his examination had triggered some kind of awakening process. The whimpering sounds were becoming more frequent and more distinct. In the larger bulge, he could hear what sounded like a woman's voice calling his name, faint and distant, but unmistakably Martha's voice saying, "Otis," over and over again. From the smaller bulge came a child's voice, equally faint, calling Papa in the exact tone Benjamin had used when he needed comfort or attention. Otis rose to his feet. The daguerreotype clutched against his chest. Every rational thought in his head told him to leave immediately, to accept that what he was witnessing was beyond human understanding and potentially dangerous. But the voices of his wife and child, calling to him after 15 years of silence, overwhelmed his caution. He approached the tree again, placing his hands against the bark directly over each bulge. The warmth was more pronounced now, and he could feel movement beneath his palms, the unmistakable sensation of living beings stirring from deep sleep. His medical training told him that whatever process was occurring here, it was reaching some kind of critical stage. The question that haunted him was whether he should help it continue or try to stop it. The voices of his family grew stronger, more insistent, and with them came a flood of memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Martha's laugh, Benjamin's excited chatter about his schoolwork, the way they'd both run to greet him when he returned from his medical rounds, all the small moments that had made life worth living before cholera stole them away. Chester's growling intensified, and the dog began backing away from the tree. His instincts were clearly telling him that whatever was happening here represented a threat, but Otis found himself unable to share that caution. These were his wife and child, impossibly returned to him when he'd given up all hope of ever seeing them again. As the sun climbed higher, the voices grew clearer, and Otis made his decision. Whatever force was responsible for this miracle, whatever price it might demand, he couldn't walk away from the chance to hold his family again. He would help them emerge from their bark cocoon, tend to their needs with all his medical skill, and tried to understand how such an impossible thing could be real. But even as he committed himself to this course of action, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered why Chester's instincts were screaming danger, and why the daguerreotype had been placed where he would find it so easily. Some gifts his experience had taught him came with hidden costs that weren't revealed until it was too late to change course. The trek back to his cabin felt like a journey through a dream. Otis moved with mechanical precision, his mind struggling to process what he'd discovered while his body performed the familiar motions of mountain travel. Chester stayed unusually close, occasionally pressing against his leg as if trying to anchor him to reality. The daguerreotype remained clutched in his left hand, its silver frame growing warm from his grip. Once inside the cabin, Otis went directly to the shelf where his medical bag had rested for 15 years. But now he needed more than the basic instruments it contained. From a wooden chest beneath his bed, he withdrew supplies he'd hoped never to use again: surgical tools wrapped in oiled cloth, bottles of chloroform and laudanum, and lengths of silk suture that remained strong despite their age. The familiar weight of these instruments brought back memories with startling clarity. The field hospital outside Gettysburg, where he'd worked for 18 straight hours, removing shrapnel and amputating limbs while cannon fire shook the earth around them. The steady hands that had earned him a reputation among the wounded soldiers. Men who would specifically ask for Doc Buckner when they were brought in screaming and covered in blood. He'd been good at it, better than good. While other surgeons hesitated or faltered under pressure, Otis had possessed an almost supernatural calm in the face of medical crisis. His fingers could find a severed artery in seconds, tie off bleeding vessels by feel alone, and perform amputations with a speed that meant the difference between life and death when anesthesia was scarce and infection was always waiting. But those skills had come with a terrible cost. Each life he'd saved had been balanced against another he couldn't reach in time. Each successful surgery had been shadowed by the knowledge that somewhere else in the hospital, another young soldier was dying while he worked. The weight of those impossible choices had accumulated like sediment in his soul, building layers of guilt and responsibility that eventually crushed his faith in both medicine and God. Now, as he organized his instruments with the same methodical care he'd once used on the battlefield, Otis felt those old reflexes awakening. His hands moved with remembered precision, checking each tool for sharpness and cleanliness, arranging them in the precise order he would need them. Whatever was happening to Martha and Benjamin in that tree, his medical training told him it was reaching a critical stage that would require immediate intervention. The voices had been growing stronger when he'd left the tree, more insistent and desperate. Martha's calls had taken on the tone she'd used when Benjamin was sick with fever, that mixture of determination and barely controlled fear that meant she needed his help urgently. Benjamin's cries had carried the breathless panic of a child who was frightened and didn't understand what was happening to him. Chester watched from his position by the fireplace, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement as Otis prepared his medical supplies. The dog had been with him long enough to recognize the signs of preparation for serious work, but his continued agitation suggested he understood that this situation was different from anything they'd faced before. The strangeness of what he'd discovered pressed against Otis's mind like a physical weight. Everything he'd learned about human anatomy and physiology insisted that what he'd seen was impossible. People didn't survive being encased in tree bark. The human body required constant circulation, regular breathing, and a dozen other vital processes that couldn't be maintained in such conditions. Yet the evidence of his senses was undeniable. The skin he'd touched had been warm and responsive. The voices he'd heard were unmistakably those of his wife and child. The daguerreotype was identical to one that should have been buried 15 years ago in a grave hundreds of miles away. His scientific mind tried to construct rational explanations. Perhaps some unknown species of tree had evolved symbiotic relationships with mammals, preserving them in a state of suspended animation for purposes he couldn't fathom. Maybe there were natural processes in these mountains that science hadn't yet discovered, geological or biological phenomena that could account for what appeared to be a miracle. But even as he entertained these possibilities, Otis knew they were inadequate. What he'd found wasn't just preservation, it was resurrection. His family had died of cholera 15 years ago. He'd seen their bodies pale and still in their coffins. He'd thrown dirt on their graves and walked away from everything he'd ever loved. The sun was approaching its zenith when he finally completed his preparations. The medical bag now contained everything he might need for what his mind insisted on thinking of as a complex delivery. Instruments for cutting and expanding the bark openings, supplies for cleaning and treating whatever injuries the process might cause, and medications for managing pain and preventing infection. As he prepared to leave the cabin, Otis paused at the small mirror mounted near the door. The face that looked back at him bore little resemblance to the confident young doctor who had once saved lives on distant battlefields. 15 years of mountain living had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth, streaked his hair with gray, and given his skin the weathered texture of old leather. But in his eyes, he could see something that had been missing for years: purpose. For the first time since Martha and Benjamin's deaths, he had a medical challenge that mattered more than simple survival. His family needed him, and all the skills he'd spent 15 years trying to forget suddenly seemed like gifts rather than curses. Chester followed him outside, but stopped at the cabin's threshold, whining softly. The dog's reluctance was so pronounced that Otis knelt beside him, running his hands through the thick winter coat while trying to understand what instincts were warning his companion away from the tree. "I know, old friend," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Something about this feels wrong to you. But they're calling for me, and I can't ignore that. I couldn't save them before, but maybe, just maybe, I can save them now." The dog's brown eyes seemed to reflect a depth of understanding that went beyond simple animal intelligence. Chester had been with him through 5 difficult winters, sharing dangers and hardships that had forged a bond deeper than most human relationships. If the dog sensed danger in what lay ahead, that warning shouldn't be ignored lightly, but the voices of his family were growing stronger in his memory, and with them came the familiar ache of loss that had driven him into these mountains in the first place. The chance to hold Martha again, to hear Benjamin's laughter, to rebuild the life that cholera had stolen from him. These possibilities outweighed any caution his rational mind might counsel. As he began the journey back to the tree, medical bags slung over his shoulder and instruments ready for use, Otis felt the weight of 15 years of isolation beginning to lift. Whatever supernatural force had preserved his family in that impossible bark cocoon, whatever price it might eventually demand for this miracle, he was prepared to pay it. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he walked, creating a silence so complete that his footsteps in the snow sounded like thunderclaps. Even the wind had stilled, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen when a man's medical knowledge confronted a mystery that defied every law of science he thought he understood. When Otis reached the tree, the changes were immediately apparent. Both bulges had grown larger overnight. The bark stretched tight like skin over swelling flesh. The pulsing rhythm had intensified, and he could see clear outlines of human forms pressing against the inner surface of the bark, as if trying to break free. Martha's voice was stronger now, no longer the distant whisper he'd heard yesterday. "Otis, help me," she called, her words muffled but distinct. "I can't breathe properly. Something's wrong with Benjamin. He keeps crying for you." From the smaller bulge came the unmistakable sound of a child sobbing. Deep, exhausted sobs that tore at Otis's heart. It was the same cry Benjamin had made during his bout with pneumonia 3 years before the cholera outbreak. When fever had left him weak and frightened, Otis set down his medical bag and approached the larger bulge first. Through the incision he'd made yesterday, he could see more of Martha's form, the curve of her shoulder, the familiar line of her collarbone. Her skin looked exactly as he remembered it, pale and smooth, unmarked by the ravages of disease or death. Working carefully with his scalpel, he began to widen the opening. The bark peeled away like old bandages, revealing more of his wife's preserved form. She wore the same blue dress she'd been buried in, though the fabric looked fresh and new, rather than aged by 15 years in the ground. Her dark hair was arranged exactly as she'd worn it in life, pulled back in the practical style she'd favored for housework. As more of her became visible, Martha's breathing grew more regular. Her eyelids fluttered, and she turned her head toward his voice when he spoke her name. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to get you out of there." The process was unlike anything in his medical experience. The bark seemed to release its hold willingly once he'd made the initial cuts, peeling away in long strips that revealed perfectly preserved human tissue beneath. It was as if the tree had been carefully wrapped around his family, protecting them rather than consuming them. But it was what he found in a fold of Martha's dress that stopped him cold. A small woolen sock, hand-knitted in a pattern he recognized immediately. It was one of a pair that Martha had made for Benjamin during the winter before their deaths. Worked in the evenings by firelight while Benjamin practiced his letters at the kitchen table, Otis lifted the sock with trembling fingers. The wool was soft and clean, showing no signs of age or wear. But more than that, it carried Martha's scent, the faint lavender she'd favored mixed with the clean smell of soap and the indefinable essence that had been uniquely hers. After 15 years, he shouldn't have been able to detect such subtle traces. Yet the familiar fragrance filled his senses and brought tears to his eyes. The sock triggered a flood of memories he'd fought to suppress. Martha's gentle hands knitting by the fire, while snow fell outside their small house. Benjamin's excited chatter about his plans to become a doctor like his father, complete with elaborate descriptions of the lives he would save. The quiet contentment of winter evenings, when the three of them were safely enclosed in their own small world, protected from the harsh realities that waited beyond their door. Those had been the last truly peaceful months of his life. By spring, the war had escalated, and his services were needed again on distant battlefields. He'd left his family to tend to strangers, convinced that his duty lay in saving soldiers who would otherwise die for lack of skilled medical care. The irony that his absence had left Martha and Benjamin vulnerable to the very death he'd been fighting elsewhere was not lost on him. A fresh burst of sobbing from the smaller bulge drew his attention back to the immediate crisis. Benjamin's cries had taken on a note of desperation that triggered every protective instinct Otis possessed. Moving to the child's position, he began the delicate work of expanding the bark, opening around his son's form. Benjamin appeared exactly as Otis remembered him, 7 years old, with Martha's dark hair and his father's serious brown eyes. The boy's face was flushed with distress, but otherwise he looked healthy and whole. Like Martha, he wore the clothes he'd been buried in, a small white shirt and dark trousers that looked freshly pressed despite their impossible circumstances. "Papa." Benjamin's voice was weak but clear. "Papa, I had such strange dreams. Where are we? Why can't I move properly?" The sound of his son's voice, unchanged by time or death, nearly unmade Otis's composure entirely. He reached through the opening in the bark to stroke Benjamin's hair, marveling at the familiar texture, the way it fell across the boy's forehead exactly as it always had. "You're safe now," he managed to say, though his own voice was barely steady. "Papa's here, and I'm going to take care of everything." As he worked to free more of Benjamin's small form, Otis noticed something that his medical training couldn't ignore. Both Martha and Benjamin were breathing, their hearts were beating, and their skin had the warmth and elasticity of living tissue. But their responses were slow, as if they were emerging from some kind of deep sedation. Their movements were sluggish, their speech slightly slurred, and their eyes had difficulty focusing on his face. It reminded him of patients recovering from chloroform anesthesia, that gradual return to full consciousness that occurred in stages. But no anesthetic he knew of could maintain its effects for 15 years, and certainly none could preserve life in the absence of food, water, or normal circulation. The bark continued to peel away under his careful ministrations, revealing more of his family with each passing hour. Martha was nearly free now, able to move her arms and turn her head, though she remained weak and disoriented. Benjamin was progressing more slowly, his smaller form still partially encased. But his cries had subsided into quiet whimpers that spoke of exhaustion rather than panic. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Otis realized that he was witnessing something that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about the nature of life and death. His wife and child, dead for 15 years, were somehow returning to him alive and whole. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that he was experiencing some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by isolation and grief. But the evidence of his senses was overwhelming. He could feel Martha's pulse beneath his fingers, strong and steady. He could hear Benjamin's breathing, see the rise and fall of the boy's chest as his lungs worked normally. Most convincing of all, he could see recognition in their eyes when they looked at him, the unmistakable light of consciousness that separated the living from the dead. Whatever force had preserved them in this impossible state was beyond his understanding. But his responsibility as both doctor and father was clear. They needed his help to complete their emergence from the tree, and he would provide it regardless of the questions that haunted his rational mind. As Otis worked to free the last remnants of bark from around Benjamin's legs, his fingers encountered something unexpected in the hollow at the base of the tree. A leather-bound book, its surface worn smooth by age, but remarkably well preserved. He pulled it free carefully, noting the weight and craftsmanship that suggested it had once been expensive and well-made. The journal's pages were filled with handwriting in multiple styles, some entries written in fading brown ink that suggested great age, others in pencil that looked more recent. The first entry was dated 1823, written in an elegant script that spoke of formal education and careful penmanship. "Found the tree today," the first entry read. "Margaret is within it, whole and beautiful as the day the fever took her. I can hear her calling my name. God forgive me, but I cannot leave her there." Otis's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Entry after entry, written by different hands across decades, told variations of the same impossible story. A widower named Thomas had found his wife Sarah preserved in the tree in 1847. A mother named Catherine had discovered her lost child there in 1859. Each writer described the same phenomenon. He was now experiencing loved ones who had died, returning to life within the bark of this ancient cottonwood. But as he read further, a pattern emerged that chilled him despite the warm afternoon sun. The early entries were filled with joy and gratitude, describing miraculous reunions and the blessing of having lost family members restored. But later entries from the same writers told different stories. "Sarah is not as she was," Thomas had written 6 months after his initial discovery. "She speaks my name and knows my face, but there is something missing behind her eyes. She stares for hours at nothing, and when I touch her, her skin is cold despite the fire." Catherine's later entries were even more disturbing. "The child that wears my Emma's face is not my daughter. It mimics her voice and remembers her favorite games, but it watches me with eyes that hold no love. Sometimes I catch it staring at me with an expression I cannot name, as if it is studying me for purposes I dare not consider." The most recent entries, written in a shaking hand that suggested advanced age or illness, carried warnings that made Otis's blood run cold. "Do not trust what emerges from the tree," they read. "The forms it creates are perfect in every detail, but they are not what they appear to be. The tree feeds on grief and love, using them to create replicas that grow stronger while the original souls remain trapped within the wood. By the time you realize the truth, it will be too late to escape." Martha's voice interrupted his reading. "Otis, why aren't you helping Benjamin? He's still partially trapped, and he's frightened." There was an edge to her tone that he didn't remember, a sharp impatience that seemed out of character for the gentle woman he'd married. He looked up to see that she had freed herself completely from the tree and was standing nearby, brushing bark fragments from her blue dress. In the fading afternoon light, she looked exactly as she had 15 years ago, young, beautiful, and vibrantly alive. But something about her posture struck him as wrong, too rigid and controlled, as if she were consciously performing the act of being Martha, rather than simply existing as herself. "I'm sorry," he said, closing the journal and tucking it into his coat. "I found this book and got distracted reading it. Let me help Benjamin right away." But as he turned back to his son, Otis noticed that Benjamin was watching him with an intensity that seemed unusual for a 7-year-old child who had just undergone a traumatic experience. The boy's dark eyes followed every movement as Otis approached, and there was something calculating in his expression that had never been there before. "What did the book say, Papa?" Benjamin asked, his young voice carrying an odd formality. "Was it interesting?" The question itself wasn't unusual, but the way Benjamin asked it, with the measured cadence of an adult trying to sound childlike, sent a chill down Otis's spine. His son had always been curious about books and learning, but this felt different, as if the boy were fishing for specific information rather than expressing genuine interest. "Just old stories," Otis replied carefully, watching both Martha and Benjamin for their reactions. Nothing important. Martha moved closer, and he caught her scent again, the lavender and soap he remembered so well. But underneath those familiar fragrances was something else. Something earthy and organic that reminded him uncomfortably of rich soil and decomposing leaves. "You look tired." "My dear," she said, reaching out to touch his face. Her fingers were warm, but felt strange against his skin, as if they were slightly too smooth, lacking the small calluses and familiar roughness he remembered from years of shared work. "Perhaps you should rest while I finish helping Benjamin." The suggestion was reasonable, even caring, but something in Martha's tone made it sound more like a command than a request. Otis found himself taking a step backward, his medical training sending warning signals he couldn't quite identify. Benjamin had managed to free one of his legs and was working on the other with a determination that seemed almost frantic. But as Otis watched, he realized that the boy's movements were too coordinated, too purposeful for someone who had supposedly been unconscious for 15 years. There was no confusion, no disorientation, no need for the gradual readjustment that should have accompanied such an experience. "Benjamin," he said carefully, "do you remember what happened before you went to sleep in the tree?" The boy's hands stilled for a moment, and when he looked up, Otis saw something flicker across his features, an expression too mature and knowing for a child's face. But it passed so quickly that he might have imagined it. "I remember being sick," Benjamin said, his voice returning to the innocent tone of childhood. "Mama was taking care of me, and you were away with the soldiers. Then everything got dark and cold, and I couldn't wake up until today." The answer was exactly what Otis would have expected from his son, complete with details that only Benjamin would know. But something about the delivery felt rehearsed, as if the boy had been preparing this response for a long time. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, Otis found himself facing a terrible possibility. The journal's warnings echoed in his mind, mixing with his own growing doubts about the behavior of his supposedly restored family. What if the miracle he'd prayed for was actually something far more sinister? What if the forms standing before him, perfect in every detail, were not truly Martha and Benjamin, but something else entirely, something that had been waiting in this tree for someone exactly like him to set it free? The thought was almost too painful to entertain, but his years of medical training had taught him to trust observation over wishful thinking. And what he was observing, despite his desperate desire to believe otherwise, was beginning to suggest that the journal's warnings might be all too accurate. The walk back to the cabin felt like a journey through a nightmare disguised as a dream. Martha walked beside him with perfect posture, her steps neither too fast nor too slow, maintaining exactly the pace she would have used in life. Benjamin skipped ahead occasionally, just as he always had, but his movement seemed mechanical, performed rather than spontaneous. Chester had been waiting at the cabin's edge, and his reaction to the approaching figures confirmed Otis's worst fears. The dog's hackles rose immediately, and he began backing away with a low growl that spoke of primal terror. When Benjamin reached out to pet him, exactly as the real Benjamin would have done, Chester snapped at the air and retreated further. "What's wrong with him?" Martha asked, her voice carrying the right note of concern. "Chester always loved Benjamin. He's probably just confused," Otis replied, though he knew that wasn't true. Dogs possessed instincts about supernatural threats that humans had long since forgotten, and Chester's reaction was as clear a warning as he could give. Inside the cabin, the wrongness became more apparent. Martha moved through the space with perfect familiarity, going directly to the water basin to wash her hands, hanging her shawl on the peg by the door, where she'd always kept it. But she performed these actions with a precision that felt rehearsed, as if she were following a script rather than acting from muscle memory. Benjamin went straight to the corner where Otis kept his few books, pulling out a volume of fairy tales that had been the boy's favorite. But instead of opening it to the well-worn pages he'd loved most, he simply held it and stared at Otis with those two knowing eyes. "Aren't you going to read to me, Papa?" he asked. And again there was that subtle wrongness in his tone, the right words delivered with slightly incorrect emotion. As evening approached, Otis prepared a simple meal while studying his family carefully. Martha helped with practiced ease, her hands moving efficiently through tasks she'd performed thousands of times. But she never once looked out the window toward the mountains she'd never seen, never asked about the life he'd built in the 15 years since her death. Her curiosity seemed focused entirely on him, watching his movements, studying his expressions, as if she were gathering information for some unknown purpose. The wedding ring on her finger caught the firelight, and Otis found himself staring at it. It was exactly right. The simple gold band he'd given her during their courtship, worn thin by years of household work. Even the small dent on one side, caused when she'd caught it on a door latch, was perfectly reproduced. But when he looked closer, he noticed something that made his blood chill. The ring showed no signs of tarnish or age, despite having supposedly been buried for 15 years. More disturbing, when Martha moved her hand, the ring seemed to shift and flow slightly, as if it weren't quite solid, but was instead part of her flesh shaped to look like gold. Benjamin's behavior became increasingly unsettling as the night wore on. He spoke in perfect imitations of his childhood voice, but his conversations lacked the random tangents and innocent observations that had characterized the real boy's speech. Instead, he seemed to be conducting subtle interrogations, asking about Otis's daily routines, his habits, his fears and regrets. "Do you miss us every day, Papa?" Benjamin asked, while pretending to read his book. "Do you think about what would have happened if you'd been home when we got sick?" The question cut straight to the heart of Otis's deepest guilt, but there was something calculating in the way Benjamin delivered it. The real Benjamin had been too young to understand the complex emotions surrounding his father's absence. Yet this version seemed to know exactly which wounds to probe as they prepared for sleep. Martha began humming a lullaby she'd often sung to Benjamin in life. The melody was perfect, every note exactly as Otis remembered it. But her voice carried no warmth, no maternal tenderness, just mechanical reproduction of sounds that had once held deep meaning. "I've missed singing to you both," she said, looking directly at Otis. "Will you let me take care of you the way I used to? Will you trust me completely?" The question felt loaded with significance beyond its simple words. Otis found himself thinking of the journal's warnings about people who had initially welcomed their returned loved ones, only to discover too late that they had invited something malevolent into their lives. That night, as Martha and Benjamin settled into the small sleeping area he'd prepared for them, Otis lay awake listening to their breathing. Both breathed with perfect regularity, too perfect, like clockwork rather than the natural variations of human sleep. And occasionally he could swear he heard whispered conversations conducted in voices too low to understand, as if they were communicating in languages he couldn't comprehend. Chester refused to enter the cabin, choosing instead to sleep outside in the cold rather than share space with the creatures that wore his family's faces. The dog's behavior was perhaps the most convincing evidence that something was fundamentally wrong. Chester had never shown fear of anything in their 5 years together, yet now he acted as if the cabin contained mortal danger. Around midnight, Otis quietly retrieved the journal and began reading by the dying firelight. The later entries painted an increasingly dark picture of what happened to those who accepted the tree's gift. Writers described watching their loved ones change gradually, becoming more controlling, more demanding, until they no longer seemed human at all. One entry, written in a shaking hand, described a man's wife who had begun eating raw meat and speaking in voices that weren't her own. Another told of a child who never aged, never grew, but developed an intelligence and cunning that seemed ancient and malevolent. The final entry in the journal was the most chilling. "They are not our loved ones returned to us. They are something else wearing our loved ones' shapes, learning to be human by watching us. But they can never truly understand love or mercy or any of the emotions that made our families precious to us." They can only mimic these things while pursuing purposes we cannot fathom. God help me, I think they are preparing for something terrible, and I have helped them by bringing them into my home." As Otis read these words, he heard Martha's voice speaking softly in the darkness. "Are you reading something interesting, my dear? Perhaps you should share it with us. After all, we're family. We shouldn't have secrets from each other." The suggestion carried an undercurrent of threat that made Otis's skin crawl. He realized that whatever he was dealing with, it knew about the journal and was concerned about what he might learn from it. The game of pretending to be his family was becoming more difficult to maintain, and he could sense growing impatience in both Martha and Benjamin's behavior. Tomorrow, he would have to make a choice: continue living with these perfect replicas of his lost family, or find the courage to confront the truth about what had really emerged from that impossible tree. Dawn brought no relief from the tension that had built through the night. Otis had slept fitfully, disturbed by whispered conversations between Martha and Benjamin that stopped abruptly whenever he stirred. Now, as pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, he watched his supposed family prepare for the day with the same mechanical precision that had troubled him the evening before. "We should return to the tree today," Martha announced, her voice carrying an authority that the real Martha had never possessed. "There might be others who need our help." The suggestion sent ice through Otis's veins. The journal had mentioned nothing about multiple victims being preserved simultaneously, but Martha's words implied knowledge of things she shouldn't understand. He nodded noncommittally while reaching for his coat, slipping the journal into an inner pocket where it couldn't be easily seen. Chester remained outside, maintaining his distance but following parallel to their path through the forest. The dog's continued hostility toward Martha and Benjamin was perhaps the clearest warning Otis could have asked for. Yet part of him still clung to the desperate hope that his fears were unfounded. When they reached the tree, Otis's worst suspicions were confirmed in the most horrifying way possible. What he saw there challenged every assumption he'd made about the nature of the miracle he thought he'd witnessed. At the base of the massive cottonwood, partially hidden beneath accumulated snow and forest debris, lay an intricate network of roots that pulsed with an unnatural light. But these weren't ordinary tree roots. They were too geometric, too purposeful in their arrangement. As he brushed away the snow for a better look, Otis realized he was looking at something that had been deliberately constructed rather than naturally grown. Embedded deep within the root system was a stone unlike anything he'd ever seen. Roughly the size of a man's head, it appeared to be carved from black obsidian, but its surface writhed with patterns that hurt to look at directly. Strange symbols covered its surface, not carved but somehow burned into the stone itself, glowing with a faint red light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The moment Otis touched the stone, visions flooded his mind with overwhelming clarity. He saw the tree's true history, not a natural phenomenon, but a trap constructed by something ancient and malevolent. The cottonwood was merely camouflage, a living shell built around a demonic binding site that had been drawing victims for centuries. The stone was the source of the tree's power, a focal point for supernatural energies that fed on human grief and desperation. When someone discovered their loved ones preserved within the bark, they weren't witnessing a miracle of resurrection, but falling victim to an elaborate deception. The tree read their memories, their deepest emotional connections, and used that information to create perfect replicas designed to ensnare and ultimately consume the living. But the most horrifying revelation was what happened to the souls of the real dead. They weren't being restored to life. They were being trapped within the stone itself, their spiritual essence harvested to power the creation of the demonic duplicates. Every person who had ever accepted the tree's gift had inadvertently condemned their loved ones to eternal imprisonment. While inviting something inhuman into their lives, the visions showed him the truth about Martha and Benjamin. They were constructs made from his own memories and emotions, possessed by entities that had been bound to the stone for purposes he could barely comprehend. Their goal wasn't simply to replace his family, but to study him, learn from him, and eventually use that knowledge to infiltrate human society on a larger scale. As the visions faded, Otis became aware that Martha and Benjamin were standing directly behind him, no longer bothering to maintain their facades of humanity. When he turned to face them, their appearances began to shift and flow like water, revealing glimpses of something far more ancient and terrible beneath. "You always were too intelligent for your own good," Martha said, but her voice now carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "We had hoped to maintain the illusion longer, but you've forced our hand by discovering the binding stone." Benjamin's form rippled, his childish features becoming angular and predatory. "The journal was supposed to be hidden more carefully," he said, in a voice that belonged to no 7-year-old. "Previous victims were never meant to find it so easily." Otis rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the medical instruments in his coat. "What are you?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be more terrible than he could fully comprehend. "We are what remains when love dies and turns to hunger," the thing wearing Martha's face replied. "We are the grief that refuses to let go, given form and purpose. For centuries, we have fed on the sorrow of those who cannot accept loss, growing stronger with each soul we claim." The creature that had been Benjamin stepped closer, its form becoming more fluid with each movement. "Your wife and son were particularly nourishing. Their deaths created such exquisite suffering, such perfect despair. When you fled to these mountains, we knew you would eventually find us." Grief always does. The truth hit Otis like a physical blow. He hadn't stumbled upon the tree by accident. He'd been guided there by his own unresolved anguish, drawn like a moth to flame by forces that understood exactly how to exploit his deepest wounds. His 15 years of isolation hadn't been healing, but preparation, allowing his grief to ferment into something these entities could use. "The others who found this place," he said, thinking of the journal's various authors. "What happened to them?" Martha's duplicate smiled with teeth that were slightly too sharp. "They served their purpose. Once we had learned enough about human nature from observing them, they were no longer necessary. Their essence joined their loved ones in the stone, adding to our power." Otis realized with growing horror that he was looking at his own fate, to be studied and consumed, his knowledge and experience harvested to make these creatures more effective predators. But unlike the previous victims, he had advantages they hadn't possessed. His medical training had taught him to think analytically, even under extreme stress, and his years of battlefield experience had prepared him for situations where survival required quick thinking and decisive action. Chester's growling drew his attention to a more immediate threat. The dog had moved closer despite his obvious fear, positioning himself between Otis and the creatures. But as Otis watched, he realized that Chester wasn't just showing protective instincts. The dog's behavior suggested he could see something that human eyes couldn't detect. Following Chester's gaze, Otis noticed that the area around the binding stone was beginning to change. Other shapes were emerging from the tree, additional victims from years past, their forms partially materialized as the stone's power fluctuated. But these weren't the perfect replicas that had fooled previous visitors. These were the trapped souls themselves, struggling to break free from their supernatural prison. Among them, Otis caught glimpses of faces he recognized from the journal's descriptions: Thomas's wife Sarah, Catherine's daughter Emma, and dozens of others who had been drawn to this place by promises of reunion with their lost loved ones. They moved like sleepwalkers, their expressions filled with a desperate hunger that spoke of years of imprisonment and suffering. "You see them now," the Martha creature said, following his gaze. "The power grows stronger as winter deepens. Soon we'll have enough energy to leave this place permanently, to walk among the living without need of camouflage or deception." The implications were staggering. These entities weren't content to remain hidden in the wilderness, preying on occasional victims who wandered into their territory. They were planning to infiltrate human civilization, using the knowledge they'd gained from decades of studying their prisoners to pass undetected among the living. As this realization settled over him, Otis understood that his situation had become about far more than his own survival. If these creatures succeeded in their plan, if they managed to break free from the binding that held them to this place, they would unleash something upon the world that humanity was completely unprepared to face. The binding stone pulsed more intensely, and with each pulse, the trapped souls became more visible. Their anguished faces turned toward him in silent pleas for release. Among them, he could see glimpses of the real Martha and Benjamin, not the perfect replicas that had deceived him, but the actual spirits of his wife and child. Imprisoned and tormented for 15 years, the choice before him was clear but terrible. He could attempt to destroy the binding stone and free the trapped souls, but doing so would likely cost him his life. Or he could try to escape, leaving these entities to continue their preparations for whatever horror they planned to unleash upon the world. Looking into the desperate eyes of his true family, seeing the centuries of accumulated suffering represented by the other trapped souls, Otis knew there was really no choice at all. Otis backed away from the demonic entities slowly, his mind racing through possibilities for escape and retaliation. The creatures that had worn his family's faces were no longer bothering to maintain their human appearance. Their forms shifted constantly, revealing glimpses of something fundamentally alien beneath the familiar features. Too many teeth, eyes that reflected light like an animal's, and movements that defied normal human anatomy. "You cannot leave this place," the Martha Thing said, its voice now carrying echoes of all the souls trapped within the stone. "We have learned too much from you to simply let you walk away. Your knowledge of medicine, your understanding of human weakness and strength, these things will serve us well in the world beyond these mountains." Chester circled them at a safe distance, his hackles raised and his intelligent eyes tracking every movement. The dog's behavior gave Otis hope. If Chester could resist whatever supernatural influence the creatures possessed, then perhaps there were limits to their power. "The binding stone requires physical contact to trap souls," Otis said, more to organize his own thoughts than to engage in conversation with the entities. "That's why you needed me to touch it, to see the visions. You can't simply force someone's spirit into imprisonment. They have to be lured into making contact voluntarily." The Benjamin creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Clever, Doctor. Yes, the ancient laws that govern our existence require a certain cooperation from our victims. But cooperation can be obtained through many means: curiosity, desperation, love, and especially grief." Otis continued backing toward the tree line, calculating distances and obstacles. His medical bag contained supplies that might prove useful in the coming confrontation. But first, he needed space to think and plan. The journal had mentioned that previous victims had all eventually succumbed to the creature's influence, but none of them had possessed his specific combination of medical knowledge and military experience. "The others who found this place," he said, stalling for time while his mind worked through the tactical situation. "How long did it take for you to fully consume them?" "Time has little meaning when you're feeding on souls," the Martha Thing replied, drifting closer with movements that suggested it wasn't entirely bound by normal physical laws. "Some lasted months before we had extracted all useful knowledge from them. Others, particularly the ones who fought hardest, provided sustenance for years." The casual way it discussed the torture and consumption of human souls filled Otis with a cold rage that reminded him of his battlefield days. He'd seen enough cruelty and senseless death during the war to understand that some enemies could only be fought with absolute commitment and no quarter given. "But you made a mistake," he said, reaching the edge of the clearing where the dense forest would provide some cover. "You assumed I would react like the others, that discovering my family was alive would override my ability to think clearly." The creatures paused in their pursuit, their forms becoming more solid, as if concentrating their energy. "What makes you different, Doctor?" the Benjamin thing asked with genuine curiosity. "Your grief was as profound as any we've encountered. Your guilt over failing to save them drove you into these mountains just as effectively as it drew the others to us." Otis smiled grimly, his hand moving to the medical instruments in his coat. "The difference is that I've spent 15 years learning to live with that guilt. I've made peace with my limitations and failures in ways that the others never had time to accomplish. And most importantly, I've been trained to function under impossible circumstances when other people's lives depended on my actions." Without warning, he pulled a scalpel from his medical kit and hurled it with surgical precision at the binding stone. The blade struck the obsidian surface and shattered into fragments, but the impact caused the stone to emit a high-pitched wail that made all three figures stagger. "Chester, run!" Otis shouted, and the dog immediately bolted for the safety of deeper forest. The distraction gave Otis the opening he needed to disappear into the dense undergrowth. Behind him, he could hear inhuman shrieks of rage as the creatures realized their prey had escaped. But more importantly, he'd confirmed his suspicion that the binding stone could be damaged by physical force. The journey back to his cabin became a deadly game of cat and mouse through terrain he knew intimately. The entities pursuing him were powerful, but seemed bound by certain limitations. They couldn't stray far from the tree, and their supernatural abilities were strongest in the immediate vicinity of the binding stone. As the distance increased, their influence weakened noticeably. Chester was waiting when he reached the cabin, and together they barricaded the door and began preparations for what Otis knew would be a final confrontation. The creatures might not be able to pursue him indefinitely, but they wouldn't give up easily. Too much was at stake for them. If he escaped and found a way to warn others about the tree, their centuries of patient planning would be ruined. From his supplies, Otis began assembling everything that might prove useful in spiritual warfare. The journal had mentioned that some of the trapped souls had been religious men, and their accounts suggested that traditional holy symbols and blessed materials could provide some protection against the entities. His own wooden cross, worn smooth by years of handling, suddenly seemed like more than just a reminder of lost faith. He'd carved it during his darkest days after losing Martha and Benjamin, pouring his grief and desperate prayers into the simple wooden shape. If faith had any power against supernatural evil, then this cross might be his most effective weapon. But he needed more than just symbols. The medical supplies that had served him through years of wilderness living now took on new significance. Alcohol for sterilization could be used to create fires that might disrupt the entity's physical manifestations. Surgical tools, properly consecrated, might be able to damage the binding stone more effectively than simple thrown objects. Working through the afternoon, Otis prepared his equipment with the same methodical care he'd once used before battlefield surgeries. Each instrument was cleaned and sharpened, each supply carefully organized for quick access under combat conditions. But unlike his wartime preparations, these tools would be used not to save lives, but to free souls from supernatural imprisonment. As evening approached, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Instead of waiting for the creatures to come to him, he would return to the tree under cover of darkness and attempt to destroy the binding stone permanently. The element of surprise might give him the advantage he needed to complete the task before the entities could stop him. The journal provided some guidance for what he was contemplating. Several entries mentioned that the stone's power was cyclical, waxing and waning, with natural rhythms that the ancient creators had built into its design. During the darkest hours before dawn, when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest, the stone would be most vulnerable to direct assault. Chester whined softly as Otis made his final preparations, the dog's instincts clearly warning against returning to that place of supernatural horror. But there was no other choice if the entities were allowed to complete their plans. The consequences would extend far beyond this remote mountain valley. "I know, old friend," Otis said, running his hands through Chester's thick coat. "This isn't fair to either of us. We came to these mountains for peace, and instead we've stumbled into something that could threaten everything we've ever cared about." The dog's intelligent eyes seemed to reflect understanding of the gravity of their situation. Throughout their years together, Chester had proven himself capable of courage when it mattered most. If Otis was going to attempt something this dangerous, he couldn't ask for a better companion. As the last light faded from the sky, Otis loaded his supplies and began the treacherous journey back through the forest. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and snow had begun to fall, conditions that would make the task ahead even more difficult. But the approaching storm might also provide additional cover for his approach to the tree. Behind them, the cabin sat empty and dark, representing 5 years of careful survival and gradual healing. Win or lose, Otis knew he would never return to the simple life he'd built in these mountains. The discovery of the tree had changed everything, forcing him to confront not just his own past, but a supernatural threat that demanded immediate action. The weight of his medical bag and improvised weapons reminded him of another nighttime mission. Years ago, when he'd volunteered to retrieve wounded soldiers from behind enemy lines. Then as now, success had required moving through hostile territory toward an objective that offered little hope of survival. But unlike that long-ago battlefield, this mission carried stakes that extended far beyond his own life. The trapped souls surrounding the binding stone represented centuries of accumulated suffering, and their liberation might be the only way to prevent something even worse from being unleashed upon the world. As they moved through the snow-covered forest toward their final confrontation with ancient evil, Otis found himself offering the first genuine prayer he'd spoken since losing his family 15 years earlier. The darkness before dawn was absolute when Otis and Chester approached the tree, for what both understood might be their final time. Snow continued to fall in thick flakes that muffled sound and obscured vision beyond a few yards. The cold was bitter enough to make his breath form clouds, but beneath his coat the small glass vial of holy water he'd consecrated using his wooden cross remained unfrozen. Against his chest he'd found the holy water in the cabin's stores, a small bottle of blessed water that the previous cabin owner had left behind, probably for protection against the harsh mountain spirits that local folklore claimed haunted these peaks. Otis had blessed it again with his cross, pouring 15 years of desperate prayer into the clear liquid, transforming it from a simple relic into what he hoped would be his most powerful weapon against supernatural evil. The tree loomed out of the swirling snow like a monument to unnatural forces. Even in the darkness, the binding stone's malevolent glow was visible through the accumulated drifts, pulsing with red light that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat. The trapped souls were more visible now in the pre-dawn darkness, their forms drifting around the stone like moths around a flame. Chester pressed close to his leg, the dog's body trembling with more than cold. Every instinct the animal possessed was screaming warnings, but his loyalty to Otis overrode his terror. Together, they had faced mountain lions, blizzards, and the countless dangers of wilderness survival. This would be their greatest test. The demonic entities were waiting, their forms more solid and threatening than they'd appeared during daylight hours. The Martha creature stood directly over the binding stone, her appearance shifting between the familiar features of his wife and something far more ancient and terrible. The Benjamin thing circled the perimeter like a predator, its movements no longer constrained by the limitations of a child's body. "You've returned," the Martha creature said, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate directly in his bones. "We wondered if you would have the courage to face us again, or if you would simply flee like the coward who abandoned his family to disease and death." The words were designed to wound, to undermine his resolve with accusations that had tormented him for 15 years. But Otis had spent the journey here, preparing for exactly this kind of psychological assault. His guilt was real, but it no longer controlled him as it once had. "I'm not here for you," he said, moving slowly toward the stone while keeping both creatures in his peripheral vision. "I'm here for them." He gestured toward the trapped souls, and their anguished faces turned toward him with desperate hope. Among them, he could see the real Martha and Benjamin, not perfect replicas, but the actual spirits of his wife and child, worn thin by years of imprisonment, but still recognizably themselves. The sight of their suffering filled him with a cold rage that reminded him of his battlefield days. These entities had not only deceived him with false hope, but had been torturing his family's souls for 15 years, feeding on their essence while using their forms to lure other victims into the same trap. "You cannot destroy the stone," the Benjamin creature hissed, positioning itself between Otis and his objective. "It has survived for centuries, weathered attempts by heroes and holy men, far more powerful than a broken mountain hermit." But Otis had advantages that those previous challengers had lacked. His medical training had taught him to find weak points in biological systems, and his examination of the stone had revealed structural flaws that might be exploited. More importantly, he carried something that none of the other victims had possessed, the absolute certainty that came from having nothing left to lose. Chester suddenly barked a warning, his attention fixed on something moving in the forest beyond the clearing. The entity's heads snapped toward the sound, their forms becoming more alert and predatory. Something else was approaching through the snow, something that made even these supernatural creatures wary. Through the swirling flakes, additional figures began to emerge from the tree line. But these weren't more demonic entities. They were the spirits of previous victims, freed temporarily by the stone's fluctuating power during the pre-dawn hours. Thomas, Catherine, and dozens of others whose stories filled the journal's pages, all drawn by the possibility of finally ending their torment. "The binding weakens," Thomas's spirit called out, his voice carrying across the clearing like an echo from beyond the grave. "Now is the time, if there is to be a time at all." The entities shrieked in rage as they realized the extent of the threat they faced. This wasn't just one desperate man attacking their stronghold. It was a coordinated assault by every soul they'd imprisoned over the centuries. The stone's power, spread across so many manifestations, was stretched to its limits. Otis seized the moment of confusion to charge toward the binding stone, his blessed surgical tools ready for the assault that would determine the fate of everyone who had ever been touched by this ancient evil. Behind him, Chester leaped at the Benjamin creature with teeth bared, his loyalty overcoming every instinct for self-preservation. The final battle for the trapped souls had begun. The Martha creature intercepted Otis just as he reached the binding stone, her form expanding into something monstrous with claws that raked across his chest, tearing through his heavy coat and drawing blood. But 15 years of mountain survival had hardened him, and he fought through the pain with the same determination that had once carried him through battlefield surgery under enemy fire. He drove his blessed scalpel deep into the creature's torso, and it shrieked as the consecrated metal burned through its supernatural flesh. The entity staggered backward, its borrowed appearance flickering between Martha's familiar features and something reptilian and ancient. "You understand nothing of what you're destroying," it hissed, black ichor seeping from the wound. "This stone maintains a balance that has protected your world for centuries. Without it, far worse things will break through from the spaces between reality." "Maybe," Otis gasped, pressing his attack with a bone saw that gleamed with holy water. "But at least those things won't be wearing my wife's face." The binding stone pulsed more rapidly as he approached, its red light casting dancing shadows across the snow. The trapped souls pressed closer, their forms becoming more solid as the stone's power fluctuated. Among them, the real Martha reached out to him with translucent fingers that passed through his skin but somehow conveyed warmth and encouragement. Chester's battle cry echoed across the clearing. as the dog grappled with the Benjamin creature. Despite being outmatched in size and supernatural strength, Chester's natural resistance to the entity's influence gave him an advantage. His teeth found purchase in the creature's throat, and it howled in frustration as it tried to shake off an opponent that refused to be intimidated by its otherworldly nature. Otis raised the vial of holy water above the binding stone, understanding that this moment would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of every soul that had been trapped here over the centuries. The liquid caught the stone's red glow, seeming to burn within a fire as he prepared to shatter the ancient prison that had caused so much suffering. "Wait!" the Martha creature called out, its voice now carrying genuine desperation rather than supernatural authority. "Look around you. See what your actions will unleash." Despite himself, Otis hesitated for a moment to follow the creature's gaze. The manifestation of so many spirits had torn holes in the fabric of reality around the tree. Through these gaps, he could see glimpses of other dimensions, realms of darkness populated by things far worse than the entities he was fighting. The Binding Stone wasn't just a prison for human souls. It was also a barrier holding back forces that would make these demons seem benevolent by comparison. But as he watched the real Martha's spirit reaching toward him with love and forgiveness in her eyes, Otis realized that some prices were too high to pay, regardless of the consequences. His family and all the others had suffered enough. Whatever emerged from the destruction of the stone would be tomorrow's problem. Today, he had the power to end 15 years of torment for the people he loved most. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the interdimensional horrors pressing against the weakening barriers. "But they've earned their rest." He brought the vial down hard against the Binding Stone's surface. The glass shattered, and blessed water splashed across the obsidian artifact like liquid fire. The stone's glow intensified to blinding proportions, then began to flicker and fade as cracks spread across its surface like a spiderweb. The demonic entities screamed in unison as their power source began to fail. Their forms became less substantial, flickering between human appearances and their true monstrous shapes. The Martha creature made one final desperate lunge toward Otis, but its claws passed harmlessly through his body. As it lost the ability to affect the physical world, Chester released his grip on the Benjamin creature and bounded to Otis's side as reality warped around the failing stone. The trapped souls began to rise, their forms becoming brighter and more defined as they were finally freed from their supernatural prison. The real Martha and Benjamin approached him, their spirits whole and peaceful for the first time in 15 years. "Thank you," Martha's spirit whispered, her voice carrying the warmth and love he remembered from life. "We can rest now." Benjamin's spirit took his mother's hand, and together they began to fade into a light that had nothing to do with the stone's malevolent glow. One by one, the other freed souls followed them into whatever realm awaited beyond death, their faces showing peace rather than the anguish that had defined their imprisonment. The Binding Stone gave a final pulse of red light, then cracked completely down the middle. As it split apart, the barriers between dimensions collapsed entirely, and Otis felt himself falling through space that existed between worlds. Chester's warm body pressed against his side as they tumbled toward an uncertain fate. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the tree itself beginning to wither and die, its unnatural vitality finally exhausted with the destruction of the force that had sustained it. Consciousness returned slowly, like emerging from the deepest sleep Otis had ever experienced. The first sensation was warmth, genuine warmth that seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than any external source. The second was the complete absence of the supernatural dread that had haunted him for days. The oppressive weight that had pressed against his mind since discovering the tree was gone, leaving behind a peace he hadn't felt in 15 years. Chester's wet nose against his cheek brought him fully awake. The dog was injured, a long gash across his flank where the Benjamin creature's claws had found their mark. but his tail wagged weakly when Otis stirred. They lay in a natural depression, perhaps 50 yards from where the cottonwood had stood, surrounded by early spring growth that shouldn't have been possible in the depths of winter. The tree was gone, not fallen or withered, but completely absent, as if it had never existed at all. In its place, a circle of rich, dark earth supported the kind of wildflowers that typically bloomed in late May. The air carried the fresh scent of growing things, and when Otis looked up, he could see patches of blue sky through clouds that were releasing gentle rain rather than snow. Winter had passed in what felt like moments, though the position of the sun suggested it was late afternoon. His body ached, as if he'd been unconscious for weeks, and his beard had grown long enough to confirm that significant time had indeed passed. The dimensional collapse caused by the stone's destruction had apparently transported them through time as well as space. Chester's wound required immediate attention, and Otis was grateful to discover that his medical bag had somehow survived their supernatural ordeal. Working with practiced efficiency, he cleaned and stitched the gash, while the dog endured the procedure with characteristic stoicism. The injury was serious, but not life-threatening, and Chester's natural resilience would see him through the healing process. As he worked, Otis became aware of a profound change in his own spirit. The guilt that had driven him into these mountains 15 years ago, the crushing weight of failure that had poisoned every day since losing Martha and Benjamin, was simply gone. Not forgotten or suppressed, but genuinely resolved in a way that mere time could never have accomplished. He'd seen their spirits in the final moments before the stone's destruction, and the peace in their faces had been unmistakable. They held no anger toward him for his absence during their illness, no resentment for the medical skills that had saved strangers but couldn't save them. They had found the rest that death was supposed to provide, freed at last from the supernatural prison that had twisted their memory into a tool for evil. When Chester's wound was properly dressed, Otis carved a simple wooden cross from a fallen branch and planted it in the center of the circle where the tree had stood. The new wood felt warm under his hands, imbued with the same sense of peace that had settled over the entire area. This would serve as a memorial not just to his family, but to all the souls who had found liberation through the stone's destruction. The journey back to his cabin revealed the extent of the supernatural winter's influence. What had been a landscape locked in bitter cold was now showing signs of normal, seasonal progression. Streams ran freely, birds called from branches that showed the first hints of budding leaves, and the entire forest seemed to be awakening from an unnatural sleep. But Otis knew he wouldn't be staying in the cabin much longer. 15 years of isolation had served their purpose, allowing him to process his grief and develop the strength needed for the confrontation with ancient evil. Now, with that chapter of his life complete, he felt called to return to the world he'd abandoned. Over the following weeks, as Chester healed and Otis prepared for their departure from the mountains, he found himself planning a future he'd never expected to have. His medical skills were as sharp as ever, and there were communities throughout the territory that desperately needed experienced doctors. The war had claimed many physicians, and the frontier was always short of men who could set bones, treat infections, and deliver babies under difficult conditions. The thought of practicing medicine again didn't fill him with the dread it once had. His failure to save Martha and Benjamin had taught him humility about the limits of medical knowledge, but it had also reinforced his understanding of how precious life was and how important it was to fight for every patient who could be saved. Chester adapted to their new direction with the same acceptance he'd shown for their mountain isolation. The dog's injury healed cleanly, leaving only a thin scar that would serve as a permanent reminder of their supernatural battle. If anything, their shared ordeal had deepened the bond between them, creating a partnership that would serve them well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The memorial cross stood alone in the peaceful clearing when they finally left, marking the spot where ancient evil had been defeated through courage, sacrifice, and faith. Wildflowers bloomed around its base, their bright colors a stark contrast to the dark soil that had once held supernatural horrors. As they walked away from the mountains that had been both sanctuary and battleground, Otis felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Not the crushing burden of guilt he'd carried for so long, but the purposeful weight of a man who understood his calling. There were people in the world who needed healing, both physical and spiritual, and he had been given a second chance to provide it. The sun was setting behind them as they reached the main trail that would lead back to civilization. Chester padded alongside him with renewed strength, and for the first time in 15 years, Otis Buckner was looking forward to tomorrow. The dead had found their rest. The living had been protected from ancient evil. And somewhere ahead lay the chance to build a life dedicated to preserving rather than mourning, the precious gift of human existence. Behind them, the memorial cross caught the last rays of sunlight, standing as a quiet testament to the power of love to overcome even the darkest supernatural forces.